On today's Locked On Jayhawks, what lessons can Kansas learn from the season and what teams ended up making it to the Final Four?
You are Locked On Jayhawks, your daily podcast on the Kansas Jayhawks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
I'm Derek Johnson. Thanks for making Locked On Jayhawks your first listen every day. You can give me a follow on Twitter at DJohnsonRadio. You can find our show with Locked On Jayhawks anywhere you get your podcast, including on our YouTube page, where you can like and subscribe to the show. So make sure you subscribe to it so you're catching all of our action here with Locked On Jayhawks. And on today's edition of the show, we're going to be talking a little bit about lessons that can be learned by Kansas basketball here in the 2023 to 2024 season that they can apply for next year and moving forward, and also lessons that can be learned from what teams made it to the Final Four, how they play, roster constructions, things of that nature, and comparing this KU one to last couple ones or under Bill Self in terms of where they excelled, where they were better, where they were worse, where they were the same. First, today's edition of Locked On Jayhawks is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. That's why LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people for your team faster and for free. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Terms and conditions apply. All right, well, let's start here. What lessons can Kansas learn from this season? Because it was obviously a down year for KU, and if you're not going to take lessons away from it, then it's almost like, what's the point? You know, if you learn some good things out of this that lead to success in the future, that's great, right? Kansas learned some lessons, I think, from the 2021 season, and they ended up winning a title the next year. And that next year wasn't a perfect team. You know, probably wasn't a top 5 team just overall in the Bill Self era, but they figured out some other things and we're able to tighten up a little bit and also bring back, 4 or 5 starters and still have some continuity. And I think there's some similarities there. So what are some lessons that this year's team can learn from last year? Well, I think one of the big things is need depth. And this has not been a new lesson. There have been other years that Kansas has played a very thin roster. I think back to, even the 2017 season, that team was relatively thin. Udoka Azubuike gets injured and, they weren't the deepest team in the world. Still, they at least had like a decent enough bench. The next season's team had an even more thin bench with the 2018 squad. That team was very thin in terms of the lack of depth. So you could have easily said, well, shouldn't you have learned a lesson there? Well, then you had 2019, which was a deep team in theory of having a bunch of guys that you thought would compete for a lot of spots and do a lot of things, but not a lot of them ended up being ready or meshed well. So that didn't really work out. And then you had kind of more of a thin team, this year, obviously. And this year's team, I think the big difference is this was probably the weakest bench in KU. There have been other benches that KU has implored. I mean, shoot, that 2017, 2018 team that made the Final Four, they were, before Silvio De Sousa arrived at mid-semester, Clay Young was playing real minutes, in-game minutes in a game against Syracuse, who had like a 7-footer, and he was like trying to defend him in the post. So, it's not new that Kansas hasn't had like a team that wasn't ultra deep, but the difference was still you look at like the 2018 team and you have Silvio De Sousa by the end of the year coming off the bench, which was like a quality big man to have come off the bench. You look at starting Devontae Graham and Malik Newman and, having LeGerald Vick and Svi Mikhailuk, and that's a lot of firepower on the offense set. Okay, you had Marcus Garrett coming off the bench of that team who was playing like 20 minutes per game, So you at least had guys, even if it wasn't the deepest bench, who could come in and that you could trust them coming off the bench. You look at this year's team, and that wasn't really the case, right? I mean, Nick Timberlake played well at the end of the season in the NCAA tournament. Marco Jackson had some moments here or there. But whenever Nick Timberlake or Marco Jackson or Jamari McDowell or Parker Brown came into a game, did you full well trust and know coming into that game that you knew what you were going to get? Right? You think of the championship team. Jalen Coleman-Lands, you knew what you were going to get when he came off the bench. He was going to make threes for you, right? You knew what you were going to get when Mitch Lightfoot came off the bench. He was going to be a solid enough shot blocker as a backup big and hit that right-handed hook over and over again. By the end of the season, you knew what you got with Remy Martin. At the beginning of the year, or maybe the midway through the year, you didn't even know if you had him. But by the end of the year, you knew you were having this, lightning in a bottle score coming off the bench. So you need depth to a certain degree. It's not that you necessarily need 10 or 11 deep. It'd be great if you could have it. In today's day and age in the portal, it's very hard to establish that. Still, look at UConn, and that's a team who has really the last 2 years, 2, 3, 4 guys coming off the bench who are like really good players. So it's definitely possible that you can accomplish it and that you can acquire it. But I think the bigger thing is if you can't quite do that, at least have like 2 guys off the bench that you can trust. And I think that goes back to the comment Bill Self had with Fran Fraschilla back in like the Big 12 tournament, how he said, we want 8 starters. And I think that makes sense, right? Even if it's 7 starters, where it's like your first 2 guys off the bench are guys that you full well trust. I think that can be enough overall, but you do need to accomplish that because you didn't have it this past year. Needing experience in the program, not just experience overall, I think was a lesson learned this year, because for the most part, like you look back to Bill Self's best teams, they've had teams that have returning a bunch of starters. They have teams that have returning a bunch of players in the program. Now, for the longest time, it was kind of impossible to decipher, is it more important that they've just been in the program, or is it more important that they're just older players in college basketball? Because, up until the last 3, 4, 5 years, the transfer portal hasn't been as rampant or as prevalent, where both of those things were in the same circle. You know what I mean? Like it was like, oh, if you are an experienced player, you probably were in Bill Self's system a while. But now that the transfer portal is around, it's hard to say, well, and you go back to the 2022 national championship season, you still didn't solve it that season because you could say, well, they had a ton of experience. Like you had Jalen Coleman-Lands, you had 4 or 5 starters coming back off the bench. I mean, Jalen Coleman-Lands like 25 years old. You had Remy Martin, who's like a 4th, 5th year player. Mitch Lightfoot was like a 6th year player, so you could have easily said, oh, it was experience. But also, what is the common theme there? You think of it, 4 or 5 starters, Mitch Lightfoot, guys who were in the Bill Self program, and Remy Martin, it took time to get together. So maybe we should have took that more as being like, yeah, it's not just that experience. Like it's not just the being old helps with Bill Self. It's the being old and knowing his system helps. Being here for multiple seasons helps. And so you look at this year's team, or I guess this past year's team, I should say, even though you had Hunter Dickinson, who was an experienced player, first year in the Bill Self program. And I don't think there was any hiccups on the offensive end, but certainly maybe there were some hiccups on the defensive end there, right? And guys like Nick Timberlake, like experienced player, but not experienced in the Bill Self system. So like, I think as we look at it, and maybe this is too hard to replicate in the transfer portal era, but I think it's more important for KU and Bill Self to have players who are in his system for multiple years than it is to have, like, if you have the option between a player in your system for a 2nd or 3rd year, or you have the option of a 5th year grad transfer, I think in the Bill Self era, I'm taking the 2 or 3 year guy in the Bill Self. And I think that's prevalent when you're talking about guys like Marco Jackson and Jamari McDowell, that you don't want these players to leave. You want to develop them in your program because Bill Self does best when those players come from within. But that also should give you a little bit of confidence if they do indeed bring back 4 of their 5 starters. I think the other one here is you need a floor of shooting. Like you need a certain level of where you're going to be. It's not that you have to have the ceiling of the 2018 team and the 2017 team from 3. You got to at least have a floor there. And there were too many games where Kansas went 3 of 14 or something like that this season. And that just can't be a thing for this Kansas team. And so they've had other years where they haven't shot it great. Like I go back to the 2021 season, Kansas shot 33.6% from 3, and that's exactly what this team shot from 3. Now, the next season, Kansas shot 36.1% from 3 and won the title. Can they get up to that this year? A big reason why was Ochai Agbaji went from being more of a streaky shooter to being one of the best shooters in college basketball, right? And that's kind of a big reason why. But it is actually funny because they made that jump in three-point shooting from 2021 to 2022, enough to win the title, with basically one guy. Because if you think about it, DeJuan Harris was, your starting point guard. I guess you had Remy Martin coming off the bench, but over the majority of the season, he just wasn't available or wasn't playing. So that certainly did help. Christian Brown was, a good three-point shooter, but didn't take a ton of them. And Christian Brown actually shot better percentage-wise his freshman year than he did by his junior year. And then Jalen Wilson, that season that they won the title, shot like 20-something%. He shot 18% from 3 in the NCAA tournament. Dave wasn't shooting threes. So my point being, if you can have like one guy go off, the problem is I don't know who that would be. Maybe if Johnny Furphy comes back, he could do what Ochai did that year, and that would be enough for you. But the point being, shooting is very important in today's age of college basketball, and you can't have enough of it, and that's really not something you can skimp out on. You don't have to be the most dynamic three-point shooting team in the world, but you have to be at least proficient at it, and I think that's what we learned a lot this season, even though that was something that was kind of a scare coming into the season. The other one is to me, I don't know, maybe this is a lesson I'm taking away. Center is the most important defensive position on the floor. It's not that you have to be a rock star defender at center. Like, I wouldn't describe David McCormick as a rock star defender. But KU had some really good defenses with David McCormick because he was at least adept. He would at least hustle hard on icing the ball screens, and he wasn't a great rim protector. And Hunter Dickinson is I think just as good of about a shot blocker, if not slightly better, honestly. And is, both are at least good, like, post-up defenders if you're going one-on-one in the post. The big difference there was Dave, even though he wasn't the most fleet of foot, was still better in those spacing settings. And, the seasons that KU had David McCormick at center, their defensive rankings were 17th, 12th, I guess you could say second in the Doak year, and 17th in 2019. So, like, they were able to do some things. This year's team is like 20th, so it's not that far out. But point being, I think center is the one position where it's like you can't really get away with a bad defender. You can get away with a bad defender who's a shooting guard. Like, okay, for instance, the 2020 team that had the tournament canceled, Udoka Azubuike was like the best defender. Well, Marcus Garrett was the best defender in the country. Udoka Azubuike was the most impactful defender in the country. Maybe this is a bad example because you had two of those guys who were studs, but like Isaiah Moss wasn't a great defender. He was like below average probably, but he's a good three-point shooter, and he had a lot of other good defenders around him, and he wasn't a center. And I think that's kind of the point here. To me, that's the one position you can't really skimp out on defense. And I think there's a reason why, a big correlation. Think about all the Big Ten teams up until this Purdue team that have had a slow-footed, really good center who have flamed out early in the tournament. Kofi Coburn never made a second weekend. Luka Garza never made a second weekend, who was like, National Player of the Year. Zach Edey, until this year, had lost to a 15 and a 16 and a 13 seed or whatever in the NCAA tournament, right? Like, it just becomes a little bit, you become less matchup proof in the NCAA tournament, I would say. So I don't know, do with that what you will. I also wondered, this was a lesson I wondered if he was going to learn, turned out not being the case, if Bill Self would view it as he's only going to take like power six guys moving forward in the portal. But I don't think that would be a smart lesson to learn, because just because you've had like two or three guys that haven't worked out, that's still such a small sample size. And I'm glad he didn't take that away, because they already added Zeke Mayo, obviously, who I think will be a great fit for KU. All right, what can we learn from this year's Final Four teams on this edition of Locked On Jayhawks? First, this episode is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. When you're hiring for small businesses, you want to find quality professionals that are right for their role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn isn't just another job board. They have a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals, which makes it easy to find the right people to hire in your network. It gives you access to professionals you can't find anywhere else. LinkedIn does all that while making the process easy and intuitive. Hiring is easy when you have that many quality candidates. So easy, in fact, that 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours, and 2.5 million small businesses use LinkedIn for hiring. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That is linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. To post your job for free, terms and conditions apply. Well, those are lessons Kansas can learn from this past season. What about lessons we can learn from the teams that made the Final Four? They clearly had success. What are some things they did well? Well, going back to the conversation about the defense, this is going to go counter with that, but maybe there is hope that you can win with more of a slow-footed center who is more offensive-based than defensive-based, because you could say NC State made the Final Four, and DJ Burns is probably an even worse defender than Hunter Dickinson is, but he's really skilled on the offensive end of the floor. You could say with Zach Edey. Now, Edey has a big impact on inside the paint because teams are fearful of going at him and when they get there, but he's not a great defender in space, and he's just dominant on the offensive end and the rebounding and everything. Donovan Clingan is kind of the exception here, because that dude is huge, but he is very quick and fast. That's why he's going to be a lottery pick. I guess same for Bama's centers, but I don't know. Maybe there's enough there that you could say, okay, those are two examples of being able to make it work. Now, the counter would be, well, Purdue surrounds Edey with a bunch of shooting. I think that's the goal for KU. I think furthermore, on the idea of playing big basketball, you could also say, well, but Kansas plays a second big next to Hunter Dickinson, and that makes it tough. I will say there actually is more two big basketball here than you might think. Purdue starts Trey Kaufman-Renn. He's 6'9", 230. He's made 8 threes, and he rarely attempts them over the course of the season. So, is it that different than you playing KJ Adams? Now, you could argue, though, where, okay, the difference is Purdue brings in Mason Gillis at the 4 as the backup 4, and he shoots over 40% from 3. And Kansas doesn't have that right now. And Trey Kaufman-Renn for Purdue is not playing the minutes that KJ Adams played this past season. KJ Adams was playing, 30 plus minutes per game, whereas with Trey Kaufman-Renn, he's playing 17 minutes per game. So the point is you can make it work, but maybe it needs to be more limited. And maybe that's something that Kansas can do, right? Maybe KJ Adams starts playing 22 minutes per game, right? 25 minutes per game, where you're playing two big basketball for 10 minutes a game, 15 minutes a game. But then outside of that, you're using him as a backup 5, and you're able to make that work a little bit more. NC State, they start DJ Burns at the 5, who we talked about. Diarra is their starting 4-man. He's made 21 threes over the course of the season, but 31% clip. Is he respected out there enough? Because that's the biggest thing. It's, are you respected out there more than are you making them at a high clip just because you want to open up the spacing on the floor? They'll even play minutes with Burns next to Middlebrooks, which we saw, and those two are combined 2 of 18 from 3. So it's not like they're getting a bunch of threes from that two big lineup either. UConn plays Steph Castle, who I know that's not a 4-man, but he's playing at the 3. He's 26% from 3 this year. And last year's team for UConn would play Andre Jackson, who shot 28% from 3. And there were times during the season for UConn where teams were basically just sagging and letting Andre Jackson be like, you want to shoot 5 threes in the game? We're going to let you, and there were some games that they lost because of it. And then, so I don't know. And maybe the fact that a guy like Diarra and Jackson and Castle even shoot it at all is enough for it to be a difference there. And I'm totally open to that and everything. My point being is that you're not that far out from tweaking a few things, adding more shooting, adding more bench play, that it could still work. And that early in the season, Kansas was able to make it work when they were kind of hitting shots more consistently from the outside. And Hunter Dickinson was shooting from the outside. Keep that in mind too. It's a lot easier to play Hunter Dickinson next to KJ Adams when Hunter Dickinson's shooting well from 3. He was shooting bonkers to start out the season. He went ice cold during Big 12 play. So point being, it still does need tweaks. I'm not saying that you're perfectly fine just rolling out the same thing. You need to adjust the minutes and, the shooting around him and all that sort of stuff. But I guess my point being is that it's not an impossible task. Okay. I would also say that just the 3-point shooting would be the last one. Think of NC State. They had a bunch of guards who could create shots and make shots. Purdue, they have a bunch of guys who can shoot threes at a high level. Fletcher Lawyer and Braden Smith, 40% 3-point shooters. Mason Gillis off the bench, 40% from 3. They have a bunch of guys who can shoot 3. UConn, Cam Spencer can knock down a bunch of threes. Tristan Newton can create a bunch of shots and hit some threes, right? They have a bunch of guys who can. Alex Caravan hits a bunch of shots. Alabama just is filled with guys who create shots and make threes. That's the other big one. Just need more 3-point shooting and dynamic scoring and creators. And I do think Kansas has made the right first step in that, because that's exactly what Zeke Mayo and Riley Kugel are bringing to the table. All right, let's compare this KU team to past KU teams with some of the stats that this year's team put up on this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. All right, let's compare this year's team, and thank you for making Locked On Jayhawks your first listen every day. And we'll be back for plenty more this week, still talking more offseason talk. It's also Spring Football Showcase for KU this Friday, so we'll give you a Spring Football preview coming up later in the week. Make sure you're subscribed every your podcast and on our YouTube page. So where does this KU team compare to other Bill Self teams? Well, 23 wins in total for this Bill Self team. That is the second worst. The only one worse was 2021. That was because of COVID, though, that they had less games. When you go by winning percentage, this one is the worst. Now, the good news is 2021 team won 13 more games the next year and won the national title. 11 losses, that is also the most. They previously had 10 in 2019 and 10 in 2014. The next season in 2015, they lost 9. The next season in 2020, they lost 3. So different examples of how they did the following season. 10 conference wins and a 56% conference winning percentage. Those are by far the worst. The next lowest was 12-6 with a 67% winning percentage in 2021. Again, they ended up winning the Big 12 and winning the national title the next year. Also the round of 32, which is outside of 2005 and 2006 when they lost in the first round, tied for the worst there. Okay, what about some of the what they did overall as a team, profiling, where areas they need to get better? Well, effective field goal percentage, they were about middle of the pack for a Bill Self team. They were actually one of the best, in fact, they were the best turnover rate offense in the Bill Self era. So this was the best offense that Kansas and Bill Self has had at not turning the ball over. Unfortunately, even though they didn't give up extra possessions there, they didn't win many back because this was the worst offensive rebounding team of the Bill Self era. It was a 25.7% offensive rebound rate. The second worst is 28.7%, which was actually the year before. And then the previous worst one would have been 29.4%, which was 2018, which was obviously a team of a bunch of shooters. That's something they have to get better at. No way around it. This was a team that was above average in 2-point offense for a Bill Self offense, 54%, which the previous best for a Bill Self offense was 2011 when they shot almost 57%. 3-point offense for Kansas at 33.6%. That is one of the worst. In fact, it is the tied for the worst in 3-point percentage. The other one they tied with, 2021. But as we mentioned, the next year they went up to 36.1%, but that took Ochai Agbaji being superhuman from three. Maybe Furphy can do that. Maybe your additions of Zeke Mayo and Riley Kugel and anything else you add in the portal can do that, but that is something you need to jump up. The other ones that were the worst, 2004 was 33.7%, but that's in an era where 3-point shooting wasn't as voluptuous, I guess. I don't even know if that's a word, but it sounded cool. And then 34.7% in 2023 was also kind of near the bottom, 34.1% in 2020, but that team was so good at everything else. Free throw shooting, 72.2%. That actually ended up being KU's best percentage shooting at the free throw line since 2015, oddly enough. They also shot threes at a very low volume, their lowest volume of attempted threes since 2015. The assist rate was the highest of the Bill Self era, but there's a certain level of like the assist rate being good where it's too high, where it's like, okay, it's so high because nobody can create shots off the dribble. Nobody can create shots unless they're being assisted. And that's a problem. So it's like, you want to have a good assist rate, but you don't want to have too good of one. And I think that's what we saw this year for Kansas. Like for instance, the 2008 team that won the title, that was at 61%. Now that team was loaded with options, but that's still 6% less than 2024. If we take a look at, I don't know, let's say 2011 team, they were 60%. 2017 team and 2018 team were both in like the 55 to 56% range. The national title team in 22 was 54%. Like you have to be able to get your own shots. As far as the defensive side of the ball, effective field goal percentage defense, 48.3% for KU this year. That was their worst until 2018 when they were at 49.1%. And the 48.3 they gave up this year was their second worst of the Bill Self era. So even though there were shooting problems and spacing problems on offense, this was by one metric the second worst defense of the Bill Self era too. They also forced just 16.5 turnover percentage. That is the second worst of the Bill Self era. They were a solid defensive rebounding team. It was their best defensive rebounding team since the 2020 team. And before that, you'd have to go back to the 2011 team. So this was a good defensive rebounding team. 2-point defense, though, 45.8% against. That was one that was okay, I guess you could say. Like they were actually a decent 2-point defense, but the 3-point defense obviously is where things were for this team. And yeah, was there a little bit of bad luck maybe involved in that? Yes, I think you could say a little bit there, but at the end of the day, as we kind of know, like I think more than just the bad luck was Kansas just not having a good 3-point defense, which was like bad ball screen defense and, not getting out to shooters, leaving guys open too often, not being able to ice ball screens and hedge with slower big men, playing too big, things of that nature that made them a bad 3-point defense, because in the end, it was 34.6% against them. That was the worst given up by KU since they allowed 35.6% in 2017, 35.5% in 2014, which was a young team, a freshman-laden team. But the difference is on those teams, the 2014 team, 31% of opponent shots were coming from three. In the 2017 team, 34% of team shots were coming from three. This year's team, 41% of team shots came from three, which tells you they were getting more open looks and they were more comfortable firing them. So it's not just that they shot them at a high percentage, they shot them at a high rate. And that obviously was a problem for KU. So I don't know, just some interesting comparisons there with this year's Bill Self team to other teams. You can take that for what it's worth in building the roster and for where they go from here. But I just thought kind of some interesting stats that I wanted to share. All right, that'll do it for this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. We'll be back with what Kansas still needs to accomplish, with other decisions still to come, and what they still maybe need to add or work around in the offseason for the rest of the way for KU, because we still haven't even gotten to the end of the regular season, I guess, technically, or the end of the NCAA season yet, with National Championship Day today. So we'll get to that. We'll try to get Nick Schwert on later in the week. We'll have some KU football content as well. This has been Locked On Jayhawks. Thanks for joining us on today's show. Find us anywhere you get your podcasts, including on our YouTube page, where you can like and subscribe to the show.